I gave my parents a luxurious one-week trip to Europe with me, but they took my jobless sister instead. They told me I wasn't going. Not after I'd spent 2 years saving, planning, and dreaming of this family trip. My parents stood on the porch, bags packed but for my sister, not me. They smiled as if it was no big deal. That morning, everything changed. And what I did next? Well, let's just say they never saw it coming. This story isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming yourself. The air that morning was colder than usual, but it wasn't the weather that made my hands shake as I pulled into my parents' driveway. The sun had barely crested over the rooftops, and my dashboard clock glowed 6:02 a.m. I took a deep breath and smiled, heart pounding with excitement and a little disbelief. After years of hard work and saving, I was finally giving my parents the trip of a lifetime, first-class flights, a 5-star hotel, tours through Paris, and quiet afternoons along the Seine. All of it was planned, down to the last breakfast croissant. I had wanted to do something meaningful, something unforgettable, not just for them, but with them. But what happened next burned through my chest like wildfire. My mom stepped out onto the porch with her usual tote bag slung over one arm. She looked calm, too calm. I got out of the van to help load the luggage, thinking we were right on time. That's when I saw my younger sister, Lauren, jogging down the steps, also wheeling a suitcase. My smile vanished. "What's going on?" I asked, trying not to let my voice crack. My mom's reply came breezy and bright, as if she were announcing a brunch menu. "Lauren's going instead. She really needs this trip. You understand, right?" The world tilted. My ears rang with silence. IWHAT? I blinked, trying to process the words. My mom gave a soft laugh, the kind she used when brushing away something silly. "Oh, honey, you're always working. You're stressed. Lauren's been having a hard time lately. She just needs a break. We all thought this would be good for her." Lauren, always the center of attention, always the one being rescued. I had been the one who spent months researching tours, carefully booking every detail, even paying for the trip out of pocket. I'd imagined us laughing in Paris cafes, snapping photos in front of the Eiffel Tower, and making memories I thought we all wanted. Lauren simply smirked. "Thanks for understanding, sis." No, I didn't understand, but I couldn't bring myself to cause a scene in the driveway. My dad emerged a moment later with his suitcase in hand, eyes avoiding mine. He mumbled a half-hearted morning and loaded his bag into the trunk. They weren't just replacing me, they were erasing me. And still, somehow, I drove them to the airport. The car ride was painfully quiet. Lauren filled the silence with shallow talk about what outfits she'd wear in Paris and how excited she was for shopping. My mom nodded and smiled, never once looking back at me. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I blinked back tears. No one asked how I was feeling. No one even said thank you. When we arrived at the drop-off zone, Lauren gave me a breezy wave and chirped, "You're the best, Violet. Seriously." I watched them disappear into the terminal, my body still as stone. The tears didn't fall until I was halfway home, hands trembling on the steering wheel, my mind echoing with their words. "She needs it more. You're always working. Don't make a big deal." My house felt colder than usual when I walked in. The air was heavy. I dropped my keys on the table and stood still, just breathing. That's when a quiet fire lit inside me, not anger, not at first, but something sharper. Resolve. I opened my laptop, logged into my travel accounts, and started clicking. One by one, I canceled the hotel reservations, the dinner bookings, the city tours. I withdrew the prepaid upgrade for the airline. Within minutes, the entire trip was undone. My hands moved quickly, efficiently. If I wasn't going, no one was going on my dime. That money was supposed to be for memories, for joy, not to be handed over like a trophy to someone who didn't lift a finger for it, and certainly not to reward my family for treating me like a spare part. The phone started buzzing the minute their flight landed in France. At first, I ignored it until curiosity got the better of me. Texts from my mom, frantic, "Violet, the hotel says we don't have a reservation. Can you fix this?" Then Lauren, irritated, "This isn't funny. We can't check in. Do something. And finally, my mom again. We are stranded. Violet, your father is furious. This is beyond childish. Fix it now. I stared at my phone. For years, I had been the fixer, the planner, the responsible one, the one who stepped in every time someone else messed up. This time, I let them sweat. I did pick up eventually. Her voice hit me like a freight train. What did you do? I answered calmly. I canceled everything. A long pause. Then her voice dropped into a low, angry whisper. Why would you do something so spiteful? Because I was uninvited from the trip I planned, paid for, and dreamed about. Be grateful I even drove you to the airport. You're punishing us, she said. This isn't how family behaves. I didn't respond. I just hung up the phone. Let them stew in it. For once, I wasn't smoothing things over. That evening, I poured a cup of tea, curled up on the couch, and allowed myself to feel everything: grief, betrayal, disappointment. But there was something else too. A strange kind of peace. They had taken my generosity for granted one too many times. This time, they would feel the cost of their choices without me picking up the pieces. And maybe, just maybe, they'd realize what it meant to lose the daughter who always held everything together. Have you ever reached a point in life where enough was truly enough? What helped you finally say, no more? The silence that followed was one I hadn't felt in years. Not the awkward, heavy silence of being ignored or dismissed, but the kind of silence that settles in when you finally stop chasing someone else's approval. For the first time in a long while, my mind wasn't cluttered with what ifs or how can I fix this. I didn't fix it. I chose not to, and in that choice, something shifted inside me. Still, the days after their departure weren't without noise. My phone buzzed with texts and missed calls. Lauren's messages came in all caps, furious, dripping with entitlement. My mom's were more subtle, each one wrapped in a ribbon of guilt. Your sister is crying. Your father is humiliated. Is that what you wanted? We're family, Violet. Families don't do this to each other. You've gone too far this time. Each message seemed less about what had been done to me and more about what I was no longer doing for them. No apology. No recognition that what they did was wrong. Just disbelief that I'd drawn a line. I didn't respond. That Saturday, Grace stopped by. She didn't even knock, just came in through the back door, like she always had when we were kids. She carried 2 mugs of coffee and a knowing look. I heard, she said, setting the mugs on the kitchen table. Your mom called me. Of course she did. My mom had a way of calling in reinforcements when her guilt trips failed. Grace, though, wasn't so easily swayed. She told me you were being cruel, Grace said, that you humiliated them, left them stranded. I raised my eyebrows. Stranded, huh? In Paris? Grace snorted into her coffee. Yeah, at a hotel that didn't exist anymore. Can you believe it? We both laughed, but there was a bitterness underneath it. Grace had seen it all growing up, the favoritism, the way Lauren was always the golden girl. I had been the one who stayed quiet, who worked hard, who made sure no one was ever uncomfortable. Even when I was. Honestly, Grace said, it's about time. That comment stuck with me all afternoon. I'd spent so many years trying to prove myself, not just to my parents, but to myself. I thought that if I just worked harder, saved more, gave more, they'd see me, they'd appreciate me. But the truth was clearer now than ever. They only valued what I gave, not who I was. On Sunday morning, my phone rang again. This time, I answered. Violet, my dad said. His voice sounded tired. Your mom wanted me to call. She thinks maybe you'll listen to me. Go ahead, I replied, sitting down slowly at the kitchen table. He sighed. Look, I know this got messy, but you've made your point. Your mom's upset. Lauren's furious. And it's just been a disaster. You're better than this. I stared at the phone. Better than what? Standing up for myself? There was a long pause. We didn't mean to hurt you, he said. We thought you'd understand. Lauren, she's just been struggling lately. And I haven't? I said, keeping my voice steady. Do you know how long I've been saving for that trip? Do you know how many extra hours I worked? How many nights I skipped dinner to make sure it was perfect? You're always strong, he said quietly. You always bounce back. I almost laughed at that. No one bounces back from being told they're replaceable, Dad. I was cut out like I didn't matter. I'm sorry, he said. But punishing the whole family, is that fair? There it was again, the shift from apology to accusation. I closed my eyes, then opened them slowly. Fair? Let me tell you what isn't fair. Planning a trip for your parents and being told at the last second that your sister is taking your place. Having your hard work treated like a favor they're entitled to. That's not family, Dad. That's exploitation. He was silent again. I didn't do this to be cruel, I continued. I did it because I finally reached my limit. He didn't argue, just said, all right, Violet, we'll talk when you're ready. I hung up and set the phone down. My hands were shaking, but I felt steady. For once, I had said everything I needed to say, and I hadn't softened the edges to protect someone else's feelings. Later that day, I took out my journal. I'd kept one on and off over the years, but I'd always written with caution, as if someone might read it and judge me. That day, though, I wrote freely. I wrote about the trip, about the sting of betrayal, and about the unexpected freedom of not answering every call. I also wrote a single question at the bottom of the page. What do I want now that I'm not responsible for everyone else's happiness? That night, I started dreaming again. Not in the big, bold, world-changing way, but in the quiet, gentle way that sneaks up on you. I imagined taking a class, painting maybe, or photography. I imagined waking up and drinking coffee on my porch without checking my phone first. And for the first time in my adult life, I imagined traveling alone. Maybe I didn't need to cancel the whole dream, just change who I was dreaming it with. Have you ever taken a stand for yourself later in life and felt stronger because of it? What gave you the courage? A few days after that final phone call with my father, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a warm mug of tea, staring at my open laptop. The spreadsheet I'd used to plan the entire trip was still saved on my desktop. I clicked it open, not out of bitterness, but out of curiosity. There it was, every line item still intact. Flights, hotel bookings, excursion details, dinner reservations down to the exact hour. I hadn't just booked a vacation. I'd crafted an experience one meant to celebrate years of sacrifice, to bring joy to the people I loved, and they gave it away like it was nothing. I stared at the empty cells where I had removed Lauren's name and deleted my parents' itinerary information. Something about seeing those gaps made me feel lighter, as if the spreadsheet itself had been a reflection of my own place in their lives. Something to be filled in when convenient, deleted when not. I didn't feel regret. I felt clarity. Later that night, Grace called. So, what's next? She asked, not bothering with small talk. I don't know, I said, brushing a curl behind my ear. But for the first time in a while, I want to figure that out just for me. Well, when you do, I hope it involves sunshine, she laughed. And maybe wine. That got a laugh out of me too. After we hung up, I pulled the spreadsheet open again, but not to edit. This time, I opened a new tab next to it. Solo travel destinations for women, I typed. My heart thudded as page after page of suggestions popped up. Italy, Spain, Ireland. I clicked through, my eyes dancing over words like freedom, renewal, adventure. It wasn't about running away. It was about stepping into something new. The next few days were filled with possibilities. I watched YouTube videos of solo travelers, read blogs about navigating foreign cities, and even joined an online group for women over 40 who travel solo. Some had stories that mirrored mine: years of caretaking, family disappointment, emotional burnout. Others had always traveled alone, never feeling the need to explain themselves. I admired them all. By the end of the week, I had booked a round-trip ticket to Rome. I didn't tell anyone, not Grace, not my coworkers, certainly not my parents. It wasn't out of secrecy, it was protection. This was mine. This was the first thing I had done that belonged to me alone. 2 weeks later, as I stood in line at the airport security checkpoint, passport in hand, I felt a flutter of nerves. Not fear, exactly more like anticipation. A quiet voice inside whispered, This is the start of something you never thought you deserved. The flight was long but calm. I sat by the window, gazing out at the Atlantic, wondering what James would have thought. He always wanted me to chase my dreams. He used to say, "You don't have to shrink to be loved, Vi. The right people will never ask you to." I missed him terribly in that moment, but I also felt him beside me in the courage, in the defiance, in the gentle rebellion of finally living on my terms. Rome greeted me with warm air and unfamiliar sounds. Everything was a little chaotic, a little overwhelming, and completely exhilarating. I didn't have anyone else's agenda to follow. I didn't have to compromise on museums or mealtimes. I was free to explore at my own pace. The first few days, I just walked. I wandered through cobbled streets, dipped into local cafes, took pictures of street musicians and flower stalls. I didn't rush. I didn't check my phone constantly. I didn't worry about being needed. I existed, fully present. One afternoon, I sat on the Spanish steps with a gelato melting down my fingers and pulled out the small journal I'd brought with me. I hadn't written in it since the night after that tense call with my dad, but now the words flowed easily. "I am not bitter," I wrote. "I am not angry. I am healing. I am free." As I wrote, I began to fill the rest of the pages with dreams, small ones and big ones. Learn Italian, start my own business, travel to 5 new places, create a life that doesn't orbit around other people's expectations. That night, I treated myself to dinner at a small trattoria near the Arno River. A string of tiny lights twinkled overhead, and the waiter brought me wine and pasta with a smile that didn't require translation. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was performing. I wasn't proving anything. I was just living. At the end of the meal, I walked back to my hotel, the air warm and scented with flowers from the nearby courtyard. I passed couples and families and laughing teenagers, and for the first time, I didn't feel out of place being alone. I felt whole. The next morning, I opened my phone and saw a message from Grace. "Are you alive?" it read. "Or did you run off with a Roman tour guide?" I chuckled and typed back, "I'm more alive than I've been in years." Have you ever done something bold, just for yourself, no one else? It's never too late to start. I woke on my 5th morning in Rome to the sound of church bells ringing through the open balcony doors. The sunlight was soft, golden, and warm across the sheets. I lay there for a moment, just breathing it in, letting it fill me. No alarms, no demands, no one calling me from the other room, just peace. After breakfast, a cappuccino and a flaky pistachio pastry, I decided to take a day trip. I bought a ticket on a slow train to Florence, where I'd always dreamed of visiting the art museums and wandering through old streets where Michelangelo once walked. The ride itself felt like a meditation. Rolling hills, ancient olive trees, stone cottages with red roofs. I watched it all go by, notebook in hand, writing thoughts between the turns of the train. I wasn't journaling to prove anything. I wasn't trying to tell a story or explain my decisions. I was just trying to hear my own voice again. When I arrived, the city felt instantly welcoming. Not overwhelming, just grounded. I spent hours walking aimlessly through quiet alleys, watching locals hang laundry from windows, sipping espresso at sidewalk cafes, and wandering into small bookstores without a schedule. There was no itinerary. There was no one to please. I was living, not managing. At sunset, I climbed up to the Piazzale Michelangelo, where the entire city stretched out below in soft orange light. People gathered with wine bottles and picnic blankets. A street musician played an old Italian love song on an accordion. And for the first time in a long while, I let myself feel everything all at once: grief, freedom, and a strange joy that cracked my chest open. I thought of James again. He would have loved this place. He would have told me to take pictures not just for memory, but for proof. Proof that I was still capable of wonder. That night, back in my Florence hotel, I received a message from my mom. It wasn't angry. It wasn't demanding. It was odd. "Hope you're safe. I found one of your old sketchbooks. Made me think of you. Call if you want." I stared at the screen for a while. It was the gentlest message she'd sent me in years, but something about it still felt loaded. Was it nostalgia? Guilt? A new angle? I didn't reply. Instead, I tucked my phone under a pillow and let the quiet hold me. The next morning, I visited the Uffizi Gallery, slowly making my way through centuries of art. Standing in front of Botticelli's Birth of Venus, I felt unexpectedly emotional. The beauty was overwhelming, but it was more than that. It was the understanding that I was allowed to have this moment. That joy didn't need to be earned through sacrifice. Later that day, while sipping wine by the Arno River, I started thinking about home not with dread, but curiosity. What would it feel like to return not as the fixer, not as the helper, not as the one who smooths things over, but as myself? I still didn't have the answer, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the question. By the time I returned to Rome for the last few days of my trip, I had already begun thinking about my next steps. I wasn't trying to rebuild a relationship with my parents. That bridge wasn't burned. It was closed for renovation. I was rebuilding me. On my final night in Italy, I sat at a quiet restaurant tucked away from the tourists, dining alone with a plate of lemon risotto and a glass of local white wine. A little girl at the next table dropped her stuffed animal, and without thinking, I bent down to pick it up for her. Her mother smiled at me, and we exchanged a few soft words in broken English and Italian. There was something comforting about it, how kindness didn't need language, just presence. Later, I walked the cobbled streets back to my hotel, taking the long way through alleyways strung with laundry and lanterns. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't avoiding anything. I was just walking. When I returned home to the States, I didn't tell anyone I was back right away, not even Grace. I just needed a little more time to hold on to the stillness I'd found. I unpacked slowly. Each item I placed back on a shelf or folded into a drawer felt like a choice. I didn't want to go back to the way things had been. I wanted something better. Grace came over the next day, as if she'd sensed it. She brought lemon bars and said, "You look different." "I feel different," I replied. We sat on the porch, and I told her about Florence. The paintings, the little girl and her stuffed toy, the way the light hits the buildings just before dusk. And then I told her about the text from my mom. Grace raised an eyebrow. "Are you going to respond?" I shook my head. "Not yet." She nodded slowly. "You'll know when you're ready." I smiled. "This time, I think I will." Have you ever taken a trip just for yourself? Not for a wedding, not for family, just for you? It's never too late to go. 2 weeks after I returned from Italy, my mother sent me a letter. A real one, handwritten, folded neatly in an envelope with my full name on the front, just like she used to write it on birthday cards when I was little. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Something about the cursive felt unfamiliar, even though it had always been hers. Inside, there was no grand apology, no dramatic explanation, just a soft, halting acknowledgement. "I found your sketchbook," she wrote again. "The one with the watercolor fox you drew when you were 12. I remember you showed it to me, and I told you it was lovely, but I didn't mean it the way I should have. You deserved more than a passing compliment. You always did. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even complete closure, but it was something." She went on to say that she and my father had started seeing a family therapist, that it was Jessica's idea, that they'd resisted at first but were beginning to see things differently. "We spent so many years focusing on what we thought you should be," she wrote. "We forgot to really see who you were." That part stopped me cold. I sat with it for a long time. Had they really changed? Or were they adapting again, shifting their tone now that they'd seen I wouldn't bend? It's hard to trust when you've been the one holding everything up for so long, when you've always been the safety net, the silent support, the one who rearranged your entire life to make sure everyone else had what they needed. I didn't respond to her letter, not right away. Instead, I let it sit on my kitchen counter while I returned to the slow, steady rhythm I'd built since coming back from Europe. My mornings were quiet. I made coffee and read on the porch. I worked on a few new designs for my freelance clients and put energy into building a small digital shop something I'd always wanted to try, but never gave myself the freedom to pursue. My weekends were filled with walks in the park, a new watercolor class I'd enrolled in, and calls with Grace, who kept cheering me on like the loyal friend she'd always been. One day, she asked, "Do you feel like you're starting over?" I thought about that, about all the years I'd spent trying to earn love instead of accepting it, about how I used to measure my worth by what I could do for others, how useful I was, how quiet, how agreeable. "No," I said finally. "I feel like I'm finally starting right." Have you ever realized you were living a life designed for someone else? How did you find your way back to yourself? A month passed before I called Jessica. We met for lunch at a small place near the library we both used to visit as kids. She looked tired, like someone who'd finally started to see the cracks in the frame she'd always called home. "I didn't know," she said, stirring her iced tea without looking up. "Not really." "I know," I said quietly. "I used to think you were part of it, but now I see you were just in it too." She looked up then, her eyes soft. "Mom and Dad are trying. I can't say they've changed, but they're trying. They're selling the boat, downsizing the house. Dad even got a part-time job." That surprised me. "They miss you," she added. "I know, but the truth was, I didn't miss the old version of them. I missed the idea of what parents could have been, the unconditional kind, the ones who showed up, who said, 'Of course we'll watch your kids, don't even ask,' and meant it. Instead, I'd raised myself emotionally. And then, when James died, I did it again, alone. And somehow, I still kept giving. Now I was finally letting go of that version of me, the one who stayed quiet to keep the peace, the one who handed over money every month without so much as a thank you, the one who planned dream vacations only to be replaced at the last second. I wasn't bitter anymore. I was just done. That weekend, I received another message. This one was from my father, shorter than my mom's, less sentimental, but raw in its own way. "I don't know how to be the dad you needed, but I'd like to try, even if I'm late." Have you ever heard an apology too late to fix the past, but just in time to shift the future? I didn't call him back, but I saved the message, and I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, some healing doesn't come in dramatic scenes. Sometimes it's quiet, slow, layered, like brushing color gently into a watercolor painting, letting the page absorb it drop by drop. A few weeks later, I mailed my mother a postcard from a local botanical garden. Nothing long, just a picture of blooming tulips and a note on the back, "Thinking of you." That was all. I wasn't ready to return to old patterns, but I was no longer carrying anger like armor. I'd stopped needing to win. I just wanted peace. Is there someone in your life who's reaching out, maybe imperfectly, but trying? Would you consider meeting them halfway? Some days I still felt a twinge of guilt, that old pull to go fix something, smooth something over, say yes even when it cost me. But each time it rose up, I reminded myself, I'm not responsible for managing anyone else's comfort. I'm allowed to choose myself. And slowly, that truth became my peace. How long did it take you to learn the difference between keeping the peace and actually having peace? You're not alone. In life, we often learn that love and loyalty should never come at the cost of our own self-worth. This story reminds us that even those closest to us, family, can take us for granted when we constantly give without boundaries. For many older adults, especially those who have spent a lifetime putting others first, it's a powerful wake-up call. Self-respect is not selfishness. It's never too late to protect your peace, speak your truth, and reclaim the parts of yourself that have been silenced by obligation. Just because we've spent years trying to keep a family together doesn't mean we must carry that burden forever. Setting healthy boundaries may feel unfamiliar or even painful at first, but it's often the only path to healing. True connection is built on mutual respect, not guilt or sacrifice. As we age, our time becomes more precious, and it should be spent in relationships where love is returned, not just expected. Let this be a gentle reminder. You are not here to be anyone's fixer, savior, or scapegoat. You've earned the right to choose peace, even if it means walking away. Your story isn't over. You get to write the ending. Make it a peaceful one.